Welcome back to Gravepath Stories. Tonight, I have 9 true terrifying Christmas Eve snowstorm horror stories. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the grave path, you don't walk alone. I was standing at the kitchen sink, hands numb from the cold water, when the singing started right outside the window. Close enough that I flinched and sloshed water onto the floor. At first I thought it was the radio bleeding through from another room, but the sound had shape and direction, voices rising and falling together, muffled by the storm, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening, my stomach tightening as the words formed clearly enough to recognize a Christmas carol I had not heard since I was a kid. My first instinct was annoyance, because nobody ever came out this far, especially not on Christmas Eve, and certainly not during a blizzard. Then one voice peeled away from the rest and sang my name, softly, like it was a lyric that had always belonged there. I turned off the tap and stood there with wet hands dripping onto the linoleum, heart pounding so hard it made my ears ring. They sang my name again, closer this time, drawn out the way my sister used to say it when she wanted my attention. No one had called me that nickname in years. Not since she died. I whispered her name without meaning to, and the sound of my own voice made me feel foolish and scared all at once. I told myself it was a coincidence, that people sang names sometimes, that the storm was playing tricks with sound. Still, I moved slowly toward the living room window, each step careful. Like the floor might give way under the weight of what I was about to see. The curtains were already parted from earlier, when I had checked the road, and through the glass I could see vague shapes standing in the snow, dark coats blending into the night. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more. Swaying slightly as they sang, heads tilted toward the house like they knew I was watching. Their faces were impossible to make out, but I could see their mouths opening and closing in time, breath fogging the air. The voice that had said my name belonged to a woman standing just a little apart from the others. She lifted her head and sang my nickname again, clearer than before, and I felt something inside me crack. I backed away from the window and leaned against the wall, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself this was ridiculous, that I was tired, that grief does strange things to the mind, especially on holidays. My sister had died 3 winters earlier in a car accident not far from here, and Christmas had never been the same since. Still, no amount of rational thinking could explain how a stranger outside my house knew the name only she ever used. I considered calling the police, but the idea of explaining this out loud made my face burn with embarrassment. Instead, I grabbed my coat and boots, telling myself I would just step onto the porch and ask them to leave. The moment I opened the front door, the cold punched the breath out of me, and the singing stopped mid-note. Silence settled so fast it felt heavy, like pressure in my ears. They all turned toward me at once. I could see their faces now, pale and ordinary, the kind of people you might pass in a grocery store without noticing. No one smiled. No one spoke. I asked what they were doing out here, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound firm. For a moment, none of them answered. Then the woman stepped forward, snow crunching under her boots, and said my nickname again, not singing this time, just saying it like a fact. I asked her how she knew me. She tilted her head the way my sister used to when she was thinking, and for a second I felt dizzy, like the ground had shifted. She said they were just caroling, spreading cheer, that they thought someone might be home. Her voice was calm, friendly even. But it didn't match her eyes, which stayed fixed on my face like she was memorizing it. I told them they needed to leave, that the weather was dangerous and the road wasn't safe. The others murmured in agreement, nodding, but none of them moved. The woman took another step closer and said my sister's name. That was when I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I had to try twice. I stood there for a moment, back pressed against the wood, listening. They started singing again, softer now. The carol blending with my sister's name, my nickname, phrases from our childhood that no one else should know. My chest hurt like I couldn't get enough air. I wanted to scream at them to stop, but I was afraid of what might happen if I acknowledged them again. Instead, I turned off all the lights and moved deeper into the house, like that might make me invisible. I spent the next hour pacing from room to room, jumping at every sound. The singing drifted around the house, sometimes near the windows, sometimes farther away, never stopping entirely. It felt deliberate, like they were testing how far they could go. At one point, I heard a knock at the back door, slow and polite, followed by my nickname spoken gently, as if whoever was there knew exactly how to get me to open it. I pressed my hands over my ears and sat on the floor until my legs went numb, telling myself that eventually they would get cold and leave. When the singing finally stopped, the silence felt even worse. I waited a long time before I dared to move, listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything. Eventually, I crept back to the front window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look. The yard was empty. No figures, no movement, just snow piled where they had stood. Relief washed over me so fast it made me lightheaded. I laughed quietly, the sound shaky and thin, and told myself it was over, that I had imagined the worst parts because of my grief. I was making myself tea when the phone rang. The sound made me jump, hot water sloshing over my hand, but I barely felt the burn. I answered without thinking, my voice tight. On the other end was my neighbor from down the road, asking if I was all right. She said she had seen people in my yard earlier and thought it was strange given the storm. I told her they were gone now, that everything was fine, and thanked her for checking. Before she hung up, she hesitated and said she thought she heard them singing a name. My name. After I hung up, I stood there staring at the wall, tea forgotten, heart sinking. I went back to the window and looked again, scanning the yard more carefully this time. That was when I noticed the footprints. There were several sets, deep and clear in the snow, leading up to the house. I followed them with my eyes, counting without meaning to. One set stopped directly in front of the window where I had first heard the singing. Another led to the back door. But there was one more, a single set that branched off and went around the side of the house, toward my bedroom window. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the storm batter the glass, replaying every word they had sung, every look they had given me. By morning, the road was buried, but the footprints were still there, preserved like evidence. When the plow finally came through, and my neighbor checked on me again, I asked her if she recognized any of the carolers. She shook her head and said no, but added something that made my blood run cold. She said she thought the woman's voice sounded familiar, like someone she used to know, but couldn't place it. A few days later, after the storm cleared, I drove into town and went to the old church where my sister's funeral had been held. I asked the pastor if any caroling groups had been organized that year, especially ones willing to go out during a blizzard. He looked at me strangely and said no, that everything had been cancelled because of the weather. I pressed him, describing the woman, her voice, the things she had said. His face went pale, and he told me there was a woman in the congregation who had died years earlier, someone my sister had been close to. She used to sing every Christmas Eve. I left without saying anything else, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, alone in my house, I finally understood what had been bothering me since the storm. The woman's voice had not just sounded like my sister's. It had sounded like grief, like memory given shape, like something unfinished. I don't know why they came, or why they chose me, but I know this since that Christmas Eve. I have never heard carolers without feeling my chest tighten. And sometimes, when the snow is heavy and the night is quiet, I still hear my nickname carried on the wind, reminding me that some voices never truly leave. I woke up because my feet were cold, not because of a sound. I remember that clearly. My socks were halfway off, twisted around my ankles, and when I pulled my knees up to my chest, I saw something dark on the carpet beside my bed. At first my brain told me it was just shadows from the hallway night light. But when I leaned over and touched it, my fingers came back damp and gritty. I slid out of bed, heart already moving too fast, and followed the marks across my floor. They weren't smudges. They were footprints. They started near my window, crossed the room, and stopped right at the edge of my bed, close enough that whoever made them could have stood over me. The prints were big, much bigger than my dad's boots, pressed deep like someone heavy had walked there. I remember staring at them and thinking, stupidly, that Santa must have come early. That was my first thought, not fear, just excitement tangled with confusion. It was Christmas Eve. He wasn't supposed to come until the night after. I stepped into the hallway and saw more of them, leading away from my room toward the living room. Snow clung to the carpet fibers, melting into dark puddles. My house was quiet in that way. It only ever was late at night, like it was holding its breath. I called out for my parents, but my voice sounded too small, like it got swallowed before it reached their bedroom. I followed the prints, barefoot, flinching at the cold wetness soaking into my skin. They went past the tree without stopping. That's when the excitement drained out of me. The presents were still neatly stacked, untouched. No torn wrapping, no empty space beneath the branches. The footprints circled the tree once, slow and deliberate, then continued toward the kitchen. I remember thinking how strange it was, that Santa wouldn't leave anything, that he'd just walk around and leave. I heard the refrigerator hum as I stepped into the kitchen, the sound suddenly loud in the quiet. The footprints stopped near the sink. Right there they ended. No turn, no fade. Just stopped, like whoever made them had lifted straight up into the air. I stood there staring for a long time, trying to make sense of it, my chest tight and my hands shaking. Then I noticed something else. Another trail. This one led the opposite direction, back toward my bedroom. These prints were lighter, smaller, almost hesitant. They started near the kitchen doorway and retraced the path through the living room, past the tree, down the hallway. I followed them back, my fear growing with every step until they led me right back to my room. They ended at my bed, on the opposite side from where the larger ones had stopped. Two sets of prints, one coming in, one leaving. That's when I started crying. I ran into my parents' room and climbed into their bed, babbling about footprints and Santa and someone in my room. My dad turned on the light. My mom pulled me close, and they listened with that look adults get when they're trying to decide if a kid is dreaming or lying. My dad walked through the house with a flashlight. He came back confused, saying the front door was locked, the windows were shut, and there were no footprints in the snow outside. None leading up to the house, none leaving. The footprints inside were already fading by the time the sun came up. By morning, they were just dark stains, then nothing at all. My parents cleaned the carpet and told me it must have been a dream, maybe sleepwalking, maybe my imagination mixing with Christmas excitement. I tried to believe them. I really did. But I knew I had been awake. I knew my feet had been cold. Years passed and the memory dulled, but it never went away. Every Christmas Eve after that, I slept with my door locked. When I was old enough, I asked my dad if he ever found anything that night, anything out of place. He always said no, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. My mom stopped putting cookies out for Santa altogether. When I was an adult, long after we moved away, I finally looked up old weather records for that night. The storm had been heavy, steady, the kind that erased tracks within minutes. I checked old photos of the house, the layout, the distances. There was no way someone could have walked to my window and back without leaving a trace outside. No way anyone could have entered and left unseen. I went back once, years later, driving those same back roads on a December afternoon. The house was still there, owned by someone else. I sat in my car and watched snow drift across the yard. For a moment, I thought I saw footprints forming near the side of the house, appearing one by one. Then the wind shifted and they were gone. I never told my parents this part, but I remember waking up again later that same night, just before morning. I remember feeling watched. I remember the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. And I remember thinking, with a certainty that still makes my stomach turn, that whatever had come wasn't Santa at all. It had just wanted to see if I was awake. I was already halfway under the rear axle when the radio crackled, sharp and sudden, making me hit my head on the steel frame and swear out loud as I rolled back onto the wet ground and stared up at the underside of the truck, heart racing for no good reason. I wiped my hands on my jacket, stood up, and answered, expecting the usual Christmas Eve nonsense. Drunk drivers or tourists who should have stayed off the coastal road. But the voice on the other end wasn't dispatch and didn't give a name. Just coordinates and a clipped sentence telling me there was a crash north of Narvik and I needed to get there now. I asked who was calling it in, because protocol mattered even on a night like this, and the line went dead before I could finish the question. I stood there for a moment, with the radio still in my hand, listening to the hiss of static, feeling that familiar tug between annoyance and duty. Christmas Eve always brought strange calls. People panicking over nothing. Phones dying, stories changing. But this felt different. I tried calling dispatch back, got no answer, and checked the system myself. No reports, no alerts, nothing flagged on the road. I should have shrugged it off. I should have gone home. Instead, I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and told myself that if it was nothing, I would turn around and be back before midnight. The drive out was quiet in a way that pressed on my ears. I kept glancing at the dashboard clock. Not because I cared about the time, but because it grounded me, reminded me things were still moving forward. The road twisted along the coast, and I focused on keeping the truck steady, hands tight on the wheel. I replayed the voice in my head, trying to pin an accent or emotion to it. But it stayed flat and featureless, like it had been read from a script. When I reached the coordinates, I almost missed the car because it sat at an angle that didn't immediately scream disaster. It hadn't gone over the edge, hadn't smashed into anything obvious. It was just there, nose tilted toward the guardrail, hazard lights blinking in a steady, patient rhythm. I parked behind it, lights washing over the scene, and stepped out, calling out automatically to check for injuries. No answer. I walked closer, boots crunching softly, and peered through the driver's window. The seat was empty. The air inside the car fogged slightly as I leaned in, warm enough that I noticed it right away, the way you notice a room someone just left. The keys were still in the ignition. The radio played faintly. A Christmas song I couldn't place, volume low, like someone had turned it down to think. I opened the door and the song cut off, replaced by silence that felt heavier than before. I called out again, louder this time, scanning the road, the edge, the space behind me. No footprints led away from the car, none that made sense. I checked the back seat, then the trunk, my movements practiced, methodical, but my chest felt tight. There was no sign of a collision that matched the urgency of the call. No broken glass scattered far, no twisted metal. Just a stopped car that should not have been empty. That was when I saw the gifts. They were piled neatly on the passenger seat and floor, wrapped in paper that still looked crisp, ribbons tied with care. I remember thinking how out of place they were, how wrong it felt to see something so domestic in that setting. I picked one up without thinking, surprised by the warmth of it through my gloves, like it had been sitting against someone's body. I turned it over to check the tag, expecting a name I didn't know. It was my name, written clearly, in a hand that mimicked my wife's careful loops, but wasn't quite right, the letters slightly uneven. Below it was my address, correct down to the apartment number. I felt a rush of heat go through me, followed by a hollow drop in my stomach. I checked the others, hands shaking now, and every single one was labeled the same way, addressed to me, different handwriting styles, as if several people had taken turns. I stepped back from the car, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt standing there. I tried the radio again, my voice coming out tighter than I wanted as I reported the situation, asked for confirmation, backup, anything. Dispatch finally answered, confused. Told me there had been no call logged, no crash reported on that stretch of road, and asked if I was sure about my location. I told them yes, described the vehicle, and there was a pause that stretched too long. They said the car's registration came back clean. owned by a man who lived in a village hours away. No connection to me, no reason to be there. They told me to secure the scene and wait. I agreed. But the idea of waiting beside that car, those gifts, made my skin crawl. I walked back to my truck, sat in the cab, and watched the hazard lights blink through the windshield. Each flash like a slow heartbeat. I kept thinking about the warmth of the packages, about how recently someone must have been there. I told myself there was a rational explanation, some prank, some misunderstanding. But my mind kept drifting to the voice on the radio, the way it had known where to send me. After a few minutes that felt like an hour, I couldn't stand it anymore. I got out and opened one of the gifts, choosing the smallest, telling myself I needed to know if this was a threat or a joke. Inside was a pair of gloves, my gloves, or at least an identical pair, worn in the same places, the lining frayed where my thumbs rubbed. I dropped them like they burned me and stumbled back, breathing hard. I knew then that this wasn't random. Someone had been watching me closely, close enough to know details I barely noticed myself. The sound of an engine made me jump, but it was just another vehicle passing by, slowing briefly before continuing on. No one stopped. No one looked twice. I felt suddenly invisible, like this was happening in a bubble only I could see. When backup finally arrived, 2 officers stepped out, their expressions skeptical but professional. I showed them the gifts, the tags, told them everything from the call to the empty car. They exchanged glances that made my throat tighten. They examined the scene, confirmed the car was warm, the gifts recent, but there were still no footprints, no signs of where the driver had gone. One officer suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, hypothermia confusion, theories that didn't fit the facts but made him more comfortable. The other stayed quiet, eyes lingering on the open car door, the wrapped packages. Eventually, they told me to tow the vehicle. Procedure. I protested weakly, said it felt wrong, but they insisted. As I hooked it up, I noticed something new. Another gift sat under the driver's seat, half hidden. I pulled it out, dread pooling in my gut, and saw that this one was labeled differently. It had my daughter's name on it, spelled the way she had learned to write it herself. I didn't open that one. I couldn't. I handed it to the officer, told him to log it as evidence, my voice barely steady. He looked at me, then with something like concern, finally understanding that this wasn't just strange, it was personal. They agreed to escort me back. The car in tow behind my truck, its lights dead now, no longer blinking. The drive back felt endless. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting the car to detach itself, to follow me on its own. When we reached the yard, they secured it and told me to go home, that they would handle the rest. I asked if they thought whoever had done this might come to my apartment. They told me they didn't see an immediate threat, words chosen carefully, and that I should spend Christmas Eve with my family. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, lights on, listening to the building settle, every sound magnified. My wife noticed immediately that something was wrong, and I told her most of it, leaving out the parts I couldn't explain without sounding unhinged. She held my hand and told me it would be okay, that people did sick things for attention. I wanted to believe her. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. An officer stood there with a box. He said they had searched the car thoroughly, and found no trace of the driver. No fingerprints beyond mine and the officer's. No DNA that matched anyone in the system. The owner of the car had an alibi, was confirmed to be at home all night. His vehicle reported stolen days earlier. The box contained the gifts. They had decided to return them to me, said there was no reason to hold on to items addressed to my family. I stared at the box, then at him, and asked about the one for my daughter. He hesitated, then said there was no gift with her name on it. He suggested I had been mistaken, stress playing tricks on me. I didn't argue. I signed the form and closed the door. I opened the box slowly, one gift at a time. Inside were ordinary things, personal but harmless. Items that showed knowledge but not malice. Clothes in our sizes. Books I had mentioned wanting. Toys my daughter loved. The gloves were there too. Everything except the one I remembered most clearly. At the bottom of the box was a final envelope, unwrapped. Inside was a note, short and simple. It said, "Thank you for always answering the call, even when no one else does." I sat there for a long time, the house quiet around me, and understood then what the crash had been. Not an accident, not a threat, but a test, or maybe an offering. Someone had needed something from me that night, had needed to know I would come. I still don't know who left that car, or where they went. I only know that since then, I never ignore a call, even when the line goes dead. I was already halfway across the lake when I realized the sound was singing and not wind. And that difference stopped me. So abruptly my boots slid forward, and I had to throw my weight down to keep from falling. The ice beneath me hummed faintly from the pressure, a deep elastic groan, but the sound under it kept going, steady and human. I stood there, bent slightly, listening hard, breath tight in my chest, telling myself it was just noise carrying strangely through the storm. Then the voices aligned, several of them rising together, and I recognized the melody as a Christmas hymn my mother used to hum while cooking. My hands went numb inside my gloves. Not from cold, but from the way my brain refused to accept what my ears were telling it. The song wasn't drifting across the surface. It was coming from below my feet. I looked down at the ice as if I might see mouths pressed against it, which is ridiculous, but fear makes you stupid. The surface was opaque, streaked with old snow frozen into pale veins, nothing visible beneath. The voices continued anyway, calm and patient, singing in a language I didn't fully understand, but somehow knew was old. I told myself to move, to keep walking, because stopping on open ice during a blizzard was dangerous even without hallucinations. My legs wouldn't respond at first. When they finally did, I forced myself into a slow, deliberate pace, counting steps in my head to stay focused. With each step, the sound grew clearer, not louder exactly, but closer, as if the lake itself were listening to me approach. I tried to remember everything I'd been told before coming out here. All the warnings about weather and isolation, but none of them included choirs under frozen lakes. This trip was supposed to be simple. A solo winter hike to clear my head after months of feeling hollow and restless. I had planned my route carefully, checked maps, spoken to locals in Kusamo who smiled politely and told me to be careful. One of the older men at the small store had looked at me for a long moment when I mentioned crossing the lake. He asked what day it was, and when I said Christmas Eve, his expression changed in a way I didn't understand then. He told me to keep moving and not stop on the ice for anything. At the time, I thought he was just emphasizing safety. The singing shifted as I walked, the harmony bending subtly, adjusting to my pace. That was the moment I felt the first true stab of panic, sharp and physical. Sounds don't do that. Wind howls, ice cracks, snow hisses. They don't follow you. I stopped again despite myself and shouted, my voice thin and shaky, asking if anyone was there. The moment my words left my mouth, the singing paused. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, heavy and expectant. I could hear my own heart pounding, loud enough to feel it in my ears. I waited, half hoping for an answer, half terrified of one. When the voices resumed, they were closer to the surface, or maybe I was imagining that. The melody changed, softened, and a single voice rose above the others, clear and intimate, like someone leaning close to whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I understood the intent with sick certainty. It was inviting me to listen, not just hear, but listen. The idea slid into my mind fully formed, not as a thought, but as a feeling, and I hated how natural it felt. I bent slightly without realizing it, lowering my head toward the ice, straining to catch more detail. A memory surfaced then, unbidden, of my grandmother warning me as a child not to press my ear to frozen rivers, because the cold could trick your senses. I clung to that rational scrap like a lifeline. I straightened up sharply, took several quick steps backward, and the ice protested with a long creak that snapped me fully back into my body. Fear surged through me, hot and urgent. I turned and began walking faster, no longer counting steps, just moving. The singing followed, matching my speed again, the harmonies tightening, growing more intricate, almost pleased. By the time I reached the far edge of the lake, my breathing was ragged and my legs were burning. The sound faded as soon as my boots touched solid ground. Cutting off so abruptly, I stumbled, thrown off by the sudden quiet. I stood there for a long moment, hands on my knees, gasping, listening for any trace of it. There was nothing but the storm and my own breath. I told myself I'd imagined it. That exhaustion and isolation had played tricks on me. I said it out loud, several times, until the words lost meaning. Then I forced myself onward toward the small cabin I'd arranged to use for the night. The cabin belonged to an elderly couple who lived farther south during winter. They'd left it stocked with firewood and basic supplies, and I was grateful for the shelter more than I'd expected to be. Inside, I shook snow from my clothes, lit the stove, and sat on the narrow bed, staring at the wall until my hands stopped trembling. I avoided thinking about the lake, focusing instead on practical tasks. Eating, melting snow for water, checking my gear. When the wind rattled the walls, I flinched, but nothing else happened. I slept in short, shallow bursts, dreaming of muffled voices and dark water pressing upward. In the morning, the storm had eased enough for me to feel safe continuing. I packed quickly, eager to put distance between myself and that place. As I stepped outside, I saw fresh tracks in the snow near the cabin, leading away toward the lake. They weren't mine. They were too numerous, overlapping, as if a group had passed through together. The sight made my stomach drop. No one had come to the cabin while I was there. I would have heard them. I told myself animals could leave confusing patterns, but I knew better. I didn't follow the tracks. I turned in the opposite direction and began the long walk back toward town. When I reached Kusamo later that day, I went straight to the same store. The older man was there again, sitting behind the counter. He looked at my face and nodded once, as if confirming something. I told him what I'd heard, stumbling over my words, embarrassed by how frightened I sounded. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he sighed and told me I was lucky. He said the lake had taken people before, especially on Christmas Eve, when the ice was thin between worlds. He said the singers were those who went under and never came back, and that they sang to remember their voices. Listening too closely, he explained, helped them remember what it felt like to breathe. I asked him why me. He shrugged and said solitude makes you louder to things that listen. He told me to leave the area and not cross frozen water again, if I could help it. I took his advice. I cut my trip short and went home the next morning. For years afterward, I avoided lakes in winter, making excuses I never explained. The memory dulled with time, softened around the edges until it felt almost unreal. Then, one Christmas Eve years later, I was walking home late through falling snow, tired and distracted, when I heard singing drifting up through the ground beneath my feet. I didn't stop to listen. I ran. I was halfway through locking the mudroom door when I saw him again, standing at the edge of the yard where the snowbanks dipped low near the fence line, bundled head to toe, and facing the house like he'd been waiting for me specifically. My hand froze on the deadbolt. I remember thinking I must have imagined it, because no one just appeared out there without leaving tracks. And yet there he was, small and still, the hood of his coat pulled so low I couldn't see his face. I stood there longer than I should have, my breath shallow, listening to the quiet thud of my heart. The radio in the kitchen was playing some Christmas song, cheerful and wrong, and I turned it off without taking my eyes off the window. When I looked back, the child hadn't moved. Not closer, not farther, just standing, hands at his sides like he'd been placed there. I grabbed my boots and shoved my feet into them, pulling my coat on with hands that felt clumsy and numb. I told myself this was simple. A kid got lost, maybe wandered from a neighboring farm. It happened even out here. You helped them, you called it in, and that was that. I opened the door, expecting the cold to hit me, expecting to see a trail of small footprints leading from somewhere sensible. There were no footprints. Not behind him, not around him. The snow was smooth and untouched until it reached the exact spot where his boots stood. It was like he'd been set down from above. I called out, asking if he was okay, if he could hear me. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, too loud, too thin. He didn't respond. He didn't even shift his weight. I took a few careful steps forward, watching the snow compress under my boots, marking my own path. When I stopped a few feet from him, I crouched down to his level. He was young, maybe 6 or 7. His coat was old and too big, the sleeves swallowing his hands. A scarf covered his mouth and nose, and frost clung to the fabric like he'd been breathing into it for a long time. His eyes were open, dark and glassy, fixed on the house behind me rather than on my face. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "You lost." "Nothing." I reached out slowly, every instinct screaming not to touch him, and rested my hand on his shoulder. The coat was stiff with cold, not damp, not snow-covered. just cold, like it had been left outside for hours. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. I pulled my hand back and stood, suddenly aware of how alone the farm was, how far the road lay beyond the fields. I told him to come inside, that he could warm up, that we'd call his parents. I even took a step back toward the door, gesturing for him to follow. He didn't move. I tried again, firmer this time, a hint of frustration creeping in. Still nothing. The longer I looked at him, the more wrong it felt. Not just the silence, but the way he seemed disconnected from the world around him, like he wasn't really there. I didn't know what else to do. Leaving a kid standing in the snow wasn't an option, so I went back inside to grab a blanket and the phone. I kept glancing out the window as I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, half expecting him to vanish the moment I looked away. He was still there when I came back out. Same spot, same posture, no new tracks. I approached again, slower now, and tried to wrap the blanket around him. As soon as the fabric brushed his coat, he stepped back. Just one step. Clean, precise. His boots pressed into fresh snow, but when I looked down, there were still no tracks behind him. Only the two prints where he now stood, perfectly formed, ending abruptly where the untouched snow began again. That was when fear finally pushed past my rational explanations. I straightened up, my pulse pounding in my ears, and asked him what his name was. He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something far away, then returned his gaze to the house. I followed his eyes. The living room window glowed faintly, the Christmas tree visible inside. I had put it up that morning, a small one, just enough lights to feel less alone. He stared at it with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You can't stay out here," I said, more to steady myself than to persuade him. "You'll freeze." He lifted one hand slowly and pointed at the door. Not at me, not at the warmth inside. At the exact spot where the threshold met the snow. Something about that broke me out of the moment. I backed away, every hair on my body standing up, and went inside, locking the door behind me. I stood there shaking, staring through the glass as he lowered his hand and resumed his stillness. I called the local line and told them there was a child on my property who wouldn't speak or move. They asked for a description, asked if he seemed injured. I said I didn't know. I said there were no footprints. There was a pause on the other end. Long enough that I pulled the phone away to check the connection. They told me to stay inside and keep an eye on him. Someone would be sent when conditions allowed. I hung up and leaned against the wall, trying to slow my breathing. When I looked back out, the child was gone. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the door, flung it open, and scanned the yard. The snow was empty. No small figure. No movement. No tracks leading away. Just my own boot prints, stopping several feet short of the door, and beyond them, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and the curtains open, watching the yard until my eyes burned. Every creak of the house made me jump. At some point, exhaustion dragged me into a shallow, uneasy doze on the couch. I woke to knocking. Soft at first, then louder. 3 slow taps against the front door. I sat up so fast my head spun. The clock on the wall said it was just past midnight. I didn't want to look, but I did anyway. He was back, standing closer this time, right at the edge of the porch. His face was still hidden, but I could see his breath fogging the air in short, steady bursts. There were still no footprints leading to him, only the ones directly beneath his boots. I didn't open the door. I asked him what he wanted. My voice shook despite my effort to keep it calm. He didn't answer. He lifted his hand again and pointed at the threshold. That was when I noticed something new. The snow between us, the narrow strip I had shoveled earlier in the day, was untouched. But right at the line where the door would open, there was a faint indentation, like the beginning of a footprint that never finished forming. Understanding crept in slowly, horribly. He wasn't waiting to come inside. He was waiting for me to cross that line. I told him to leave. I told him help was coming. I told him he couldn't stay there. My words bounced uselessly off the glass. He didn't react. The knocking started again, louder now, insistent. Each tap echoed through the house, vibrating in my chest. I backed away, shaking my head. Whispering no over and over like that might make a difference. Eventually, the knocking stopped. When morning came, the yard was empty again. The officers arrived late, walking the perimeter asking questions. They found nothing. No tracks. No evidence. No missing child reports that matched my description. One of them suggested stress, isolation, imagination. I didn't argue. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen. I thought it was over. The next Christmas Eve, I heard the knocking again. This time, when I looked out, the child was smiling. His scarf had slipped, revealing a pale, blue, tinged face, eyes too wide, lips cracked. He pointed at the door, then slowly, deliberately, stepped back. A single set of footprints appeared behind him, leading away from the house. They stopped at the fence. I sold the farm that spring. I never spent another Christmas Eve alone. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the snow is deep, I still think about that line at my door and how close I came to crossing it. I was rinsing dirt from my hands at the kitchen sink when the first knock hit the door, sharp and deliberate. The way my brother used to knock when he didn't want to be mistaken for anyone else. I froze with my fingers still under the tap, my mind lagging behind the sound, because I had watched him be lowered into the ground that afternoon, watched soil cover the lid, watched the funeral director smooth the earth flat like a finished sentence. The knock came again, slower this time, patient, familiar. And my chest tightened so hard, I had to brace myself against the counter to keep standing. I didn't answer right away. I told myself grief does strange things, that memory can echo when the house is quiet, that stress can recreate sounds with frightening accuracy. I shut off the water and listened. There it was again, 3 knocks, spaced just the way he always did. Not urgent, not angry. Like he expected me to open the door, because of course I would. I whispered his name without realizing I'd done it, and hearing my own voice say it made my throat burn. I walked toward the front door slowly, each step deliberate, as if rushing might shatter whatever fragile explanation I could still cling to. My hand hovered over the handle. The wood felt cold through the metal, solid, real. Another knock landed, closer somehow, as if he leaned in when he did it. I leaned forward and spoke through the door, telling myself I needed to hear it aloud. I asked who was there. Silence followed, just long enough for my heart to start pounding, and then his voice came through the wood, quiet and unmistakable. He said my name the way he always did, stretching the first syllable when he wanted something. I backed away so fast my shoulder hit the wall. My thoughts scrambled for order. I told myself I had imagined the voice, that it was memory replaying at the worst possible moment. But then he spoke again, asking me why I was taking so long, saying it was freezing out there, that he just needed to come in for a minute. He sounded tired, not angry. The same tone he'd used when he showed up unannounced after long shifts. The sound of him was so right it hurt. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the door like it might open on its own. I pressed my palms to my ears, but that didn't stop the next knock or the soft scrape of knuckles against wood. He laughed then, a short breathy sound, and said he knew I was home. He reminded me my car was out front. He told me not to make this weird. Hearing him say that almost broke me, because that was exactly what he'd say when I overthought things. I thought about the cemetery, the way the earth had looked darker where it was freshly turned. I thought about the weight of the shovel in the groundskeeper's hands. I thought about the paperwork I had signed only hours earlier. I forced myself to stand and stepped closer again, anger flaring through the fear. I told him this wasn't funny, that if someone was messing with me it needed to stop. My voice shook, but it was loud enough. He went quiet for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for footsteps retreating, for laughter, for anything normal. Instead, he sighed. He told me he knew it was confusing. He said he hadn't meant to scare me. He said things hadn't gone the way they were supposed to. My mouth went dry. I asked him what he meant, and there was a pause, the kind that used to mean he was choosing his words carefully. He said he couldn't talk about it out there. He asked me to open the door just a little. He promised he'd explain everything once he was inside. I thought about the last time I'd seen him alive, about the argument we'd had over nothing important, about how I'd let him leave without fixing it. My hand moved toward the handle again before I stopped myself. I remembered the feel of his jacket when I hugged it at the viewing, empty and heavy at the same time. I told him he was dead. I said the words out loud, sharp and ugly, because I needed to hear them. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound he'd made. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It wasn't wrong exactly, but it was thinner, stretched tight like fabric pulled too far. He said he knew. He said it hadn't stuck. He told me, sometimes things don't stay where you put them, especially when they leave something unfinished behind. I felt sick. I asked him what he wanted. He answered immediately, like he'd been waiting for the question. He said he needed me to let him in so he could rest. He said it was too hard to stand out there, remembering everything at once. I backed away again, my heart racing so hard I could hear blood in my ears. I told him I couldn't. I said I was sorry, that I loved him, that I couldn't open the door. The knocking started then, not gentle anymore, not patient. The door rattled with each hit, and his voice rose, pleading at first, then frustrated. He told me I owed him. He reminded me of promises I'd made when we were kids, of times I'd sworn I'd always be there. He told me this was me being there. I slid the deadbolt into place, even though it already was. The sound felt small against the force of his knocking. I backed into the living room, grabbed my phone with shaking hands, and called our mother without thinking. It rang and rang. While it did, His voice shifted again, losing the edge, going quiet, almost gentle. He told me I was doing the right thing by calling her. He said she'd want to talk to him too. He said she'd been upset when he didn't come home. She answered finally, groggy and confused, and I started talking too fast, words tumbling over each other. I told her he was at my door. I told her he was talking to me. She went very quiet, then told me to listen carefully and not open it. She told me to go into the bedroom and lock the door. She told me no matter what I heard, I was not to open anything. Her voice shook when she said it. That scared me more than the knocking. I did what she said. I locked myself in the bedroom, sat on the floor with my back against the door, and pressed the phone to my ear. Through the house, I could still hear him. He had stopped knocking and started talking, his voice carrying easily down the hall, as if walls meant nothing. He talked about the funeral, about how strange it had been watching us cry. He talked about the box, about the pressure, about how dark it was. I squeezed my eyes shut, bile rising in my throat. My mother told me to breathe, to stay with her. She told me he had been pronounced dead at the scene, that there was no mistake. She told me there was nothing at my door. As she said it, he laughed, a sound that cut off abruptly, like he'd choked on it. He told me she was lying, because she didn't want to accept it. He told me she'd always been good at pretending things were fine. He told me to think for myself. The doorknob behind me rattled, not the front door. The bedroom door. I screamed and shoved back, bracing my feet against the wall. My mother shouted my name through the phone. I told her he was inside. I told her he was trying to get in. The pressure on the knob eased, and his voice came through the door, close enough that I could feel it vibrate in my chest. He told me I'd locked the wrong door. He told me it hurt to be shut out. I don't know how long I sat there. My legs went numb. My jaw ached from clenching it. At some point, the talking stopped. The house went quiet in a way that felt wrong, like the air itself was holding still. My mother stayed on the line, whispering to me, telling me to stay put. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, there was a sound at the front of the house, a single knock, softer than before. He called my name one last time, not angry, not pleading, just sad. I stayed where I was until the sky began to lighten and birds started making noise outside, until the normal sounds of morning crept back in. When I finally unlocked the bedroom door, the house was exactly as I'd left it. The front door was still locked, the bolt unmoved. There were no footprints outside, no marks on the wood. Nothing to prove any of it had happened. Later that day, I went back to the cemetery with my mother. The grave was undisturbed, the soil smooth and heavy. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet, and for the first time since the knocking stopped, I believed he was really gone. I was tightening the strap on my pack when the radio crackled and said my name like it was right next to my ear, not coming through static from somewhere up the mountain. I froze with one glove half on, my breath catching hard enough to hurt. Someone behind me laughed nervously and said the signal was bad tonight. But the voice came again, clearer this time, calm and female, asking us not to stop because she was getting cold. We had only been assembled for maybe 20 minutes, standing in a loose line near the trailhead while the coordinator assigned partners. Christmas Eve, just after dusk. and every one of us looked tired already. I had volunteered because I lived closest and because the missing hiker was a woman about my age, early 30s, last seen that morning. Her name was Rachel. I remember that clearly. Rachel Madsen. I remember because the voice on the radio sounded like she was smiling when she said it. The coordinator took the radio from my hand and asked who had keyed in. No one answered. He tapped the unit, frowned, and said we were picking up interference from another channel. He told us to stick to protocol, keep moving, and report anything unusual. When he handed the radio back, his fingers shook just enough for me to notice. We started up the trail in pairs. I was with a woman named Linda, who had done searches before. She talked steadily, explaining how people often walk downhill when lost, how hypothermia made you do strange things. I nodded and tried to focus on the sound of our boots instead of the radio clipped to my shoulder. Every few minutes it hissed softly, like it was breathing. About half an hour in, the radio clicked again. This time it wasn't saying my name. It was calling out directions. It said the word left, then pause, then said don't take the ridge. The voice was close enough that I instinctively turned my head, expecting to see someone just off the trail. Linda stopped walking. She stared at me and asked if I'd heard that. I told her yes, and the relief on her face scared me more than if she had said no. Linda raised her own radio and asked for confirmation from base. The coordinator came back immediately, his voice tight, telling us to ignore any transmissions that weren't clearly identified. He said Rachel's phone battery had died hours ago, and there was no way it was her. As if on cue, the radio crackled, and the voice said, "I know my phone is dead. That's why I'm using this." No one laughed that time. We regrouped, all of us, tighter than before. One of the men suggested turning back, said this was getting unsafe. The coordinator reminded him that someone was still missing and time mattered. He looked straight at me when he said it, like he knew that the voice had chosen my radio on purpose. I wanted to argue, but my throat felt locked. As we moved deeper, the voice kept coming back, not constantly, but just often enough to pull at us. It never begged. It never screamed. It sounded patient, reasonable. It commented on things we could see, like the fallen tree we had to climb over, or the narrow section where the path slanted. At one point it said, "Watch your footing here, it's slick," and Linda slipped seconds later, catching herself just in time. She looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "How would it know that?" We found the first sign of Rachel about an hour in. A glove half buried, the same brand shown in the photo they had passed around earlier. The coordinator marked the location and told us we were close. The radio stayed quiet for a long stretch after that, long enough for my nerves to settle into something like numbness. I started telling myself there had to be an explanation. Some sick prank. Someone else on the mountain with a scanner. Anything. Then the voice came back, softer now, and said, "I dropped that because my hand went numb. I didn't notice at first." Linda stopped responding to the radio after that. She kept walking, jaw clenched, eyes fixed ahead. I wanted to tell her we should slow down, that this didn't feel right. But every time I opened my mouth, the radio filled the silence first, nudging us onward, always just beyond where we were. The trail narrowed into a section I hadn't planned on entering. The coordinator hesitated, when he saw where we were headed. Then checked his map and said the voice was probably leading us to a shortcut. He sounded like he was convincing himself. When he asked for objections, no one spoke. I think we were all afraid that if we stopped listening, the voice would stop helping, and whatever was out there would stay lost forever. The radio began using names then. Not just Rachel's, but ours, mine, Linda's, the coordinators. It pronounced them perfectly, with the same tone people use when they're trying to keep you calm. It said things like, "You're doing great," and "just a little farther," and "I can hear you breathing now." That last part made my skin crawl, because there was nothing but wind and our own movements around us. We found Rachel's pack near a stand of trees, torn open, supplies scattered like she'd been in a hurry. Linda knelt and touched the fabric, then pulled her hand back like it burned. She said she was here recently. I asked how she knew. She didn't answer. The radio went quiet again, long enough for hope to creep in. Maybe we really were close. Maybe she was alive, injured but waiting. The coordinator told us to spread slightly. Call out. When I shouted Rachel's name, my voice sounded thin and wrong in my own ears. Somewhere ahead, the radio answered me with my own words, played back a second late. That was when the first person turned around and started walking back without saying anything. A man I didn't know, face blank, eyes unfocused. The coordinator grabbed his arm and asked what he was doing. The man said he was cold and tired, and that Rachel had already been found. The coordinator said that wasn't true. The man frowned, genuinely confused, and asked then why the radio had told him it was over. We pulled him back into the group. The radio stayed silent, like it was sulking. It came back with a different tone, sharper now. It said we were wasting time. It said she couldn't feel her legs. It said if we cared, we'd hurry. Linda started crying quietly. I put an arm around her without thinking. She leaned into me like she'd been waiting for permission to fall apart. We reached a drop-off I didn't remember from the map. Not sheer, but steep enough that a fall would be bad. The voice told us to go down. The coordinator hesitated longer this time. He asked the radio to identify itself. It answered by describing the scar on his chin, the one he'd gotten as a kid. He swallowed hard and gave the signal to proceed. Halfway down, my radio slipped from its clip and dangled, swinging against my side. The voice changed when it realized it was lower, closer to the ground. It started sounding distorted, stretched. It kept talking anyway, like it couldn't stop. It said, "I'm right here, you're almost there. I can see your boots." I stopped. I couldn't make myself take another step. Linda bumped into me and swore. I told her I was done, that something was wrong. She looked past me, down the slope, and shook her head. She said, "She's down there. I can hear her." The coordinator called for a pause. The radio cut in immediately. Angry now, accusing us of leaving her to die. It said names we hadn't shared. It described things we'd done alone. It told me about the night I'd sat in my car outside my mother's house after her funeral, because I couldn't go in yet. I dropped the radio into the snow like it was alive. It kept talking. Even muffled, even half buried, the voice carried. It said if we didn't come down, it would follow us back. It said it already knew the way. That was enough. The coordinator ordered a full retreat. No debate this time. We turned as one and started back the way we came, faster than was safe. The radio voices multiplied as we climbed. Not just Rachel anymore, but echoes of us overlapping, repeating fragments of conversation from earlier in the night. Linda was sobbing openly now. Someone was praying. I kept my eyes on the ground and counted steps, afraid that if I looked back I'd see someone else walking with us. When we reached the trailhead, the voices stopped all at once. The silence was so sudden it rang. We stood there panting, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Search and rescue professionals went back out the next morning. They found Rachel's body less than a mile from where she'd last been seen, in an area we never went near. Hypothermia, no radio, no phone, no explanation for what we heard. The coordinator quit a month later. Linda moved away. I still volunteer, but I won't take a radio on Christmas Eve anymore. Sometimes, when it's quiet, I swear I can hear my name carried on static from somewhere I'm not supposed to go. I was still pulling my coat off when I noticed how warm the house felt, like we had never left. And I remember thinking that was strange, because I knew the heating timer dropped after midnight, and we had been gone longer than that. My wife was behind me, juggling leftovers and gifts, and she said something about how nice it was to come home to lights already on. I didn't answer. I was listening. The house had that quiet you get when someone is trying very hard to be silent. I called out the babysitter's name as I stepped into the living room. No answer. I said it again, louder, forcing cheer into my voice, because I didn't want to sound suspicious over nothing. Our daughter ran past us, boots still on, shouting that she was tired and wanted her bed. She stopped halfway up the stairs and turned back to us. "She's still upstairs," she said. I told her that was fine, that she could say good night in the morning, and I asked my wife to put the food down while I went to settle up with the babysitter. I remember feeling annoyed in a small, practical way, the kind of irritation that comes from thinking someone is being unprofessional. It was Christmas Eve, and we had been clear about the return time. The stairs creaked more than usual under my weight. Halfway up, I called her name again. Still nothing. At the top, the hallway light was on, and the door to our bedroom was closed. The guest room was open and empty. The bathroom light was off. Our daughter was standing at her door, watching me. "She's in your room," she said, very matter of fact. That stopped me. We had never told the babysitter she could use our bedroom. It felt invasive, even as a thought. I knocked once, lightly, then again, harder. I said her name. There was no movement, no sound, not even the shift of someone breathing. I opened the door. The room was empty. The bed was made the way it always was, tight corners, pillows stacked just so. The air felt cooler in there, like the warmth from the rest of the house had not reached it yet. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for something to make sense. When I turned back into the hallway, our daughter was still watching me. "She's hiding," she said. She said it was a game. My wife came up behind me then, asking what was taking so long. I told her the room was empty. She laughed once, uneasy, and said maybe the babysitter had stepped outside. That made less sense. Her shoes were still by the door. Her coat was on the hook. Her bag was gone, though, which I noticed only because I had been looking for something to explain her absence. We called her phone. It rang in the living room, muffled. like it was buried under cushions. My wife found it between the couch and the wall, vibrating against the baseboard. The screen lit up with my name. She looked at me, and the annoyance I had been feeling drained away, replaced by something colder. Our daughter tugged at my sleeve. She told me to wait, she said. She said you'd come up. I crouched down to her level and asked her to tell me exactly what she meant. Like she frowned, concentrating, like she was trying to remember the rules of something important. She said she was tired, she said. She said she was going to lie down upstairs and that I should stay in my room. She said not to be loud. I asked her when that happened. She shrugged. Time doesn't mean much to a child when nothing is supposed to change. My wife was already moving through the house, checking rooms, opening doors too fast, calling out the babysitter's name with a tremor she couldn't hide. I told our daughter to stay where she was and went after her. Every room was the same. Empty. Normal. Too normal. No signs of a struggle, no broken things, no mess. The house felt staged, like a photograph. I went back to the stairs and looked up at the dark landing again. My heart was beating hard enough that I could hear it. I didn't want to go back up there, but I couldn't explain why. She's still upstairs, our daughter repeated, more quietly now. I asked her where upstairs. She pointed toward the end of the hall, toward the storage room we used for old boxes and holiday decorations. The door to that room was closed. I don't remember deciding to open it. I just remember my hand on the knob, my wife behind me, her breath shallow and fast. I remember thinking that this was stupid, that we were letting our imaginations run away from us. The room was dark and smelled faintly of dust and pine from the artificial tree stored there. The light switch was just inside the door. I flipped it. The babysitter was sitting on the floor against the far wall, her knees pulled to her chest, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were open. They were fixed on the door. My wife screamed. I don't remember screaming myself, but I must have, because my throat burned afterward. I remember dropping to my knees beside her, even though I knew, instantly and completely, that she was gone. Her skin was cold. Her lips were blue. There were marks on her wrists, dark and finger-shaped. I pulled back, shaking, and told my wife to call for help. She stumbled out of the room, nearly falling down the stairs. I stayed there, because I couldn't leave our daughter alone upstairs, not after that. I called her name, trying to keep my voice steady. She's sleeping, my daughter said from the hallway. She said not to wake her. I turned slowly. My daughter was standing in the doorway, looking past me into the room. She didn't seem afraid. She seemed confused, like something hadn't gone the way it was supposed to. I told her to go downstairs now, and she hesitated, then did as I said. I closed the door to the storage room and locked it, even though I knew how useless that was. The police came. An ambulance came. The house filled with strangers and noise and questions that blurred together. They asked us when we had last seen her alive. They asked if anyone else had been there. They asked our daughter questions we didn't want her to hear. The official cause was strangulation. There was no sign of forced entry. No one could explain how she had been killed without a struggle loud enough to wake a sleeping child. They asked our daughter again what she had seen, what she had heard. She talked to me, she said. She told me to wait. They asked her to describe the game. She thought for a long time. She said she was going to be very quiet, she said. She said I should be very quiet too. She said someone was upstairs and that we shouldn't let them hear us. That was the first time any of us had heard that part. They never found anyone else. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong. No neighbors reported seeing or hearing anything. The snow outside had erased any tracks by morning. But even that didn't explain how someone could have come and gone without being noticed. We moved a few months later. We told ourselves it was for a fresh start. Our daughter stopped talking about the babysitter after a while, but sometimes, when the house was quiet, she would look up the stairs and ask if someone was tired. Years later, she told me something she hadn't said before. She said the babysitter never came upstairs. She said the woman who told her to wait was already there, standing in the hallway, smiling, with hands that were very cold. I was halfway up the frozen path when the bells rang, and I stopped so suddenly my boot slid back a step and my stomach lurched with it. I remember gripping my torch too tight and whispering, "No," under my breath like I could cancel the sound if I said it fast enough. The bells were deep and slow, not frantic, not broken, ringing the way they were meant to ring, full and steady, echoing through the whiteout as if the church was alive and waiting. I stood there listening, my breath loud in my ears, trying to count the seconds between each toll, because that was something solid to hold on to. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Wind. Ice. Some idiot with a rope and too much alcohol in his blood. Anything but the thing everyone in the village said. The thing I had laughed at earlier that night. I had only come out because my mother was worried. She said the old man from the last house by the tree line hadn't checked in all day. And with the roads buried and Christmas Eve pressing in, she didn't want him alone. I said I would walk up and knock, make sure he had heat, maybe share a drink. I remember rolling my eyes while pulling on my coat, because that was the kind of son I was then, still thinking fear was something you outgrew. The bells rang again, and I felt it in my chest, a vibration that didn't fade right away. I thought of the church on the hill, blackened and empty since the fire, roof half collapsed, doors nailed shut by the council years ago. No electricity, no caretaker, no bells hanging in the tower, because they had been taken down after the dead were pulled out. That was a fact. I knew it the way you know your own name. I told myself to turn back. I even shifted my weight to do it. Then the bells rang a third time, closer somehow, as if the sound had learned the shape of me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly dropped the torch, reaching for it. It was my mother, asking if I had made it yet. I typed back that I was still walking, that everything was fine, and that was the first lie of the night. The path narrowed as I went on, and I stopped thinking about the old man entirely. All I could picture was the bell tower, empty and open to the snow, ringing without hands. I remembered being a boy, sitting through Mass and staring up at the ropes, imagining how heavy the bells must be, how much force it took to make them sing. You didn't just brush against them. You worked for that sound. When I reached the old man's house, the windows were dark, but smoke still curled from the chimney. I knocked hard, called his name, and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder, and finally the door creaked open a crack. He was standing there in his coat, hat on, eyes wide and glassy, like he had been waiting. "They rang," he said before I could speak. I told him I heard them too, and he laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. He said that meant it wasn't him, and for a moment I didn't understand what he meant. Then he stepped aside and let me see the packed bag by the door, the food laid out on the table like offerings. He said he had heard them once before, the night his brother died in the fire. He said they rang for him, and he didn't go. "They don't like being ignored," he said quietly. I told him he was talking nonsense, that someone must be up there playing a trick. He shook his head and asked me how I thought bells rang without bells. I had no answer. The silence between us felt heavier than the snow pressing against the walls. Another toll rolled through the air, closer again, and this time it sounded wrong, strained, like something forcing itself to remember how to be a bell. The old man's hands started to shake. He told me I should go, that I was young, that maybe they would pass me by. I didn't want to leave him alone, but fear has a way of making decisions for you. I backed toward the door, mumbling excuses, promising to send help in the morning. Outside, the sound guided me, each step pulling me uphill whether I wanted it or not. I kept telling myself I was only checking, only proving to myself that it was empty. The church appeared through the blowing white like a broken tooth, and when the bells rang again, I realized they were coming from inside the tower, deep and true. The door was no longer nailed shut. I stood there, heart hammering, and every story I had ever heard came flooding back. How the bells rang for those who would die before morning. How they called you by sound alone. I should have run. Instead, I stepped inside because I needed it to end. The tower was dark, the stairs slick with ice, but the sound grew stronger as I climbed. At the top, there were no bells. Only charred beams and twisted metal, and in the center, a space where the floor had collapsed. The ringing stopped, and in the silence, I understood. It wasn't the bells calling someone to die. It was the dead calling someone to take their place. I screamed, slipped, and felt the floor give way. I woke hours later in the snow below, the bones screaming but alive. The bells never rang again. The old man was found dead in his chair the next morning, peaceful, bag still packed. They say the bells only ring once more now, when someone hears them and survives. I hear them sometimes late at night, soft and distant, reminding me they didn't get me yet, and one day they will.